think is interesting, the clip which you just played, actually, where it's clear that Churchill is really bringing a kind of breaking news. He's not just sort of glossing what people know already, he's really bringing information directly to the people, and surely being aware that that's going to sort of trigger a huge amount of rejoicing.
Absolutely, and Downing Street put out a sort of official version of the speech, which means as the speech progresses you can hear some music and some sound effects as well. Let's just hear how the speech began.
Yesterday morning at 2:41 a.m. at General Eisenhower's headquarters, General Jodl, the representative of the German High Command, and of Grand Admiral Dönitz, the designated head of the German state, signed the act of unconditional surrender of all German land, sea, and air forces in Europe to the Allied expeditionary forces and simultaneously to the Soviet spy command.
It's so interesting what you said earlier, Professor Toy, about effectively Churchill doing breaking news, as it were, live on the radio. So, would you call this a speech or more of a sort of statement by Churchill? I mean, did it have the rhetorical flourishes, of course, for which he is so famous?
Well, I mean, in fact, it's not really one of his famous speeches, right? So, obviously, it was important, but it was, I think he probably appreciated he was going to have lots of opportunities, including on VE Day itself, to make more speeches. And what he was really focusing here was getting the message across. And so the speech really comes in three parts. One is the facts about the surrender and when it will come into effect. The second is kind of a sort of little potted history of the war, paying tribute to Britain's allies, but also kind of vindicating Britain's role at the period when she stood alone in 1940-41. And the third part is to remind people that the war is actually still going on in the Far East and that there will be continued struggles ahead. So, in a way, there aren't really any spectacular or very memorable flourishes. The British ambassador to France, Duff Cooper, records that it was kind of a disappointing speech. Well, in a way, I think that Churchill probably knew that the effect of his announcement was going to be such that he didn't need to add on lots of flourishes. He'd had 6 years, if you like, to think about what he was going to say at the end of the war, and he seems to have chosen not to try and make this a sort of a spectacular or enormously stirring speech, but to be quite, I wouldn't say low-key, but certainly more low-key than his more famous speeches.
Yeah, matter of fact. Let's hear a bit more of the speech.
Hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight, Tuesday, the 8th of May. But in the interest of saving lives, the ceasefire began yesterday to be sounded along all the fronts. And our dear Channel Islands are also to be freed today.
You said that earlier that people were desperate for news. For how long would people know that the end of the war was coming?
The end of the world is coming.
In a sense, they've known that it was coming since the end of 1942 and the Battle of El Alamein, where Churchill had said, this is not the end, it's not the beginning of the end, it's perhaps the end of the beginning. And so, people, it was fairly clear from the point, really, when both the USSR and the USA were in the war, it was clear who was going to win. But in terms of when it was going to happen, well, the planning assumptions in government had been that the war would end on the last
Churchill's speech. I mean, he did.
It's weird.
lazima nilale kitumbo na
The
siwezi
point you're
kulala na
making,
pillow.
which is so interesting, is he had 6 years to think about what
Yeah.
to do. This was not a speech where he needed to rouse the nation. The nation was relieved. You earlier quoted the end of the beginning speech. Those were the kind of speeches which he needed to really prepare, because it was about keeping everybody's morale.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, he did spend an awful lot of time preparing his speeches, particularly major ones which he had to give in the House of Commons. This would kind of typically take kind of 3 or 4 days of in dictating and drafts being circulated and so on. And it was really, a pretty time-consuming thing for him to do, because, of course, he had bureaucratic assistants, but he didn't typically use speech writers. I mean, he'd kind of take a line from somebody here or there, but that was really quite rare. And so, I suppose that, like, an interesting thing about this particular moment in his career is that he knew that he kind of reached the peak, that he could kind of never really equal this again. Perhaps he felt he couldn't even, even 1945 was disappointing to him in a way after the heights of 1940 and 1941. And so, of course, he does go on, and of course he loses the election in 1945, but goes on to become Prime Minister again in 1951. He makes other famous speeches like the Iron Curtain speech in 1946. But I think this is almost a kind of a bittersweet moment for him.
Really, really interesting. Let's hear a bit.
After gallant France had been struck down, we from this island and from our united empire maintained the struggle single-handed for a whole year, until we were joined by the military might of Soviet Russia, and later by the overwhelming power and resources of the United States of America. Finally, almost the whole world was combined against the evildoer, who are now prostrate before us.
I wonder, in drafting those remarks, why Churchill made the point that we stood alone for a year. Is it important to kind of say to the British people, you really did do the bit? We know that we won this war because we had the help of the Russians and we had the help of the Americans, but it wouldn't have happened if we hadn't stood alone.
Well, there's certainly that message, but in a way, the British people might have reached that conclusion themselves. I actually see this being more as a message directed at the United States. Remember that Britain continued to need an awful lot of economic assistance from America. Of course, this actually came about with a major US loan after Churchill falls from power in 1945. But it wasn't only Churchill who was making this point about Britain providing a loan at that point. That they were trying to say to the Americans, not necessarily a particularly good persuasive technique with the Americans, but they were saying, really, we kept kind of carrying the can for this period in 1940 to 41. Therefore, you should be generous in your economic treatment of us. And that wasn't necessarily a message which was going to go down too well with senators and congressmen or with the American people. But it was certainly something which British politicians of all stripes wanted to emphasise.
Interesting. Let's hear how his remarks ended.
Our gratitude to our splendid allies goes forth from all our hearts in this island and throughout the British Empire. We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing, but let us not forget for a moment the toils and efforts that lie ahead. Japan remains unsubdued. We must now devote all our strength and resources to the completion of our task, both at home and abroad. Advance Britannia. Long live the cause of freedom. God save the King.
Well, rhetorical flourish at the end, but again, going back to your earlier remarks, Professor, about
hapo, lakini kuna mtu yotoka nyuma yangu, maanake namwona huyu yuaje. Huyu yuaingia sasa, mimi najaribu niingie huko, lakini kuna mtu yoja nyuma yangu spidi.
3 hours of news, views and sparkling commentary.
Hata hapo signal.
This afternoon from 4 on Times Radio with NatWest Cushion, making workplace pensions and savings easy. Search NatWest Cushion to find out more.
Listen to Times Radio on your smart speaker. Just say, play Times Radio.
Here's the truth about AI. AI is only as powerful as the platform it's built into. ServiceNow puts AI to work for people across your business, removing friction and frustration for your employees, supercharging productivity for your developers, providing intelligent tools for your service agents to make customers happier, all built into a single platform you can use right now. That's why the world works with ServiceNow. Visit servicenow.com/UK/AI for people.
Between spring's blossoms and summer's full bloom lies the perfect season for a family road trip. Turn those must-drive moments into calm wait-to-drive adventures. And with the Mazda Spring SUV sales event running between the 8th and 26th of May, enjoy 0% APR representative and an additional deposit contribution of £1,000 on new Mazda CX-5 and CX-60. Search Mazda. Available on PCP through Mazda Financial Services by 30th of June 25. Indemnities may be required. Terms apply. See website.
FAZ on Times Radio.
Welcome back to Sid Facing on Times Radio. Chris,
Naenda kuingia na kuna mtu yu already yuko na high speed ile truck ya green. Yuaje. Yeye naye yuaingia hata hapo.
Yellow Submarine took over from Ringo Starr in Thomas and Friends. It was actually Paul Angelis, Michael's brother, who voiced Ringo in the Yellow Submarine. So that has been cleared up.
Barabara ina maneno, but hao watu wa truck drivers wasengine wanaishi barabarani.
Michael, Paul, and Ringo. The other interesting fact Chris hasn't put through his text, but I can, is that not only did Angelis voice Ringo in the submarine, he also voiced George Harrison. Digital dialogue. Not one thing. Ryan is not making much sense to me. Who's the other one who voiced Ryan? Mealy Munchie or something. Anyway, there you go. Yeah, I've got to go to Rod Little now. Keys told me rather. Bee's my goddaughter. Kia tells me I've got to speak to you, Rod. It's all for
weren't accepted at all many years ago. Now they lived completely hidden. And we were a younger generation, we kind of knew, but the older generation didn't want to know.
So it's a leadership by example, acceptance being something that you can almost learn by osmosis. You see the Pope doing it, and you find it easier to do yourself.
Oh yes, exactly.
That's
I mean,
beautiful.
it's a kind of chicken and egg. You don't know whether society. When I go back to Argentina, I see changes all the time. So I don't know whether the social change and the church follows it, or the church leads. I think it's like a I don't know. They do it together. They kind of change together.
It's a brilliant point that you make, because of course, I suppose for millions of Catholics, the Pope holds an epic position in their consciousness, even if they don't spend an awful lot of time thinking about it. And if their consciousness also includes a prejudice, and the Pope becomes an emblem of opposition to that prejudice or undoing that prejudice, then the power is soft but considerable, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And also it kind of gives you, like a reference point. You can bounce back. You can have a discussion with someone and say, well, his mum, your cousin, he should be living in sin, it's sinful. And you kind of say, yeah, but this thing can be accepted rather than condemned. And so you kind of fool that. For my family.
You need right to be a sin, but we're not the Pope.
This is hard work.
Well, no, 20, 30 years ago, I lived in Argentina, and I live in Spain now, and in some areas of Spain, this was a big thing,
That's true, yeah, and that's another thing that I think perhaps we lose sight of slightly as a consequence of not being in a Catholic country. Can I ask you a really weird question? Is there still a go-kart track in Estepona?
Yes,
Thank
there is.
goodness for that.
Yes.
Thank goodness for that.
Very,
Very happy memories of that go-kart track,
like
Talia. It may have moved in the
I know,
ensuing 40-odd years, but goodness me, I thought I was going to be the next
Any
Nigel
situation
Mansell
in
one
Europe
afternoon in
there
Spain.
is thousands and thousands and thousands of people.
1980s.
In one
51 is the time.
situation.
Speaking of foreign countries, I
What's that, go on?
love the story of the
Post office, watakwenda post
superstar
office.
DJ, absolutely
mtaenda
on
kwenye
top of
post.
his game
Tutaipeleka
in this country,
wenyewe.
Usisahau
who
please.
just announced completely out of the blue that he was knocking
It's
it all on the head and
important.
moving to Australia to start again. Do you know who I'm talking about? I bet you
There's
do. If you're
thousands
my
and
age,
thousands
you do.
and thousands
Talking
of
about
people in
Christian
that
O'Connell,
situation.
who has pulled it off in spectacular fashion, but whose decision to make that extraordinary change, to hang up his headphones, and he had some of the biggest jobs in the business, and take the whole family to Australia as a relative unknown or a complete unknown and just start again. I didn't know the full details of what had led up to that and why he's done it. So I sat down with him a couple of weeks ago for full disclosure, and that was one of the many things that we talked about. I always feel a bit impostery when I'm with people like Christian or Chris Moyles or Chris Evans, actually, when people who've just got radio absolutely